Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar convened by 6 Horizon Europe projects that all have in common that they deal with blue forests. Blue forests refer to productive coastal ecosystems and include mangrove forests, seagrass meadows, tidal salt marshes, and kelp forest, all crucial for maintaining marine biodiversity, supporting fisheries, filtering water, and protecting shorelines from erosion and storm surges. They are also highly efficient in storing and sequestering atmospheric carbon, known as blue carbon, which makes them vital for addressing climate change. Beyond these 6 projects that you can see on the screen, the Norwegian Blue Forest Network is also a convener of this webinar. My name is Sindre. I'm a Chief Development Officer at the Norwegian Institute for Water Research, and I have the pleasure of being the moderator of today's webinar. The webinar is technically managed by the coordinator of the BlueMissionAA project, the Air Center from Portugal, and Catarina Duarte is supporting us technically in the back. You won't see her. And the webinar is also one of the BlueMissionAA webinar series, Atlantic and Arctic Lighthouse Weekly Hour. One of our speakers today, Ivan Conesa-Alcolea from DG Research and Innovation, will in his presentation cover all 4 major blue forest ecosystems. When specifically addressing the blue carbon dimension of the blue forest ecosystem. Yet the rest of the webinar will focus upon kelp forest only and in Norway only. Geographically speaking, kelp forests are found in temperate and Arctic regions of the world oceans, as seen in this simplified global map to the left, taken from the authoritative kelp report Into the Blue, Securing a Sustainable Future for Kelp Forests, published jointly by the United Nations Environment Programme and the Norwegian Blue Forest Network in 2023. When looking at the clip out of European part of the global map, it's evident that kelp forests predominantly are found in the Atlantic Arctic Lighthouse area when considering the mission ocean geography, yet with some limited kelp areas also in the Baltic Sea, the North Sea, and the Mediterranean Sea. Norway, with all its fjords, has the world's 2nd longest coastline, only beaten by Canada. Bioclimatically, kelp is found along the entire coast, making Norway a global kelp superpower. However, in the southern parts and the northern parts of the kelp forest, they experience serious problems. In north, the main direct cause is the excessive grazing by sea urchins, while in the south, excessive nutrient loads, eutrophication is the main problem. These problems have led the Norwegian Parliament request the government to prepare a national plan for restoration of its degraded kelp forest. The work to prepare this national kelp restoration plan is just about to start up as we speak. A major national conference was organized late last year, and the 3 presentations by Norderhaug, Rinde, and Sander draws upon presentations given at this national conference. On the screen, you see today's agenda. Some of the speakers have slightly different titles compared to what was announced earlier, but we think that this will cause no problem. We have given a specific focus to the problems of the northern kelp forest. You see that we have a question and answer discussion session starting at 14:50. We presume that some of you have to leave at 3 o'clock, but we intend to continue until 3:15. And we are sure that several of you would like to interact in today's webinar, and here you can see the opportunities you have. With regards to the presentations, for quick clarifications, please use the chat function in Zoom. If we are not able to address it directly after the presentation, the presenter will try to answer in the chat. If you have more comprehensive, extensive questions or discussion points, we encourage you to use the Q&A function in Zoom, or alternatively, use the raised hand function when moving into that final discussion part. And without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome our first speaker today, Ivan Conesa-Alcolea, who is a policy officer at the European Commission's DG for Research and Innovation, where he focuses on marine biodiversity and ecosystems. He manages research and innovation policies, collaborative projects, and EU funding programs related to these areas. And his work supports key EU initiatives, including the mission to restore our ocean waters by 2030. So hereby, I give the word to you, Ivan, and wish you good luck.
Thank you very much, Sindre. And good afternoon to all the panelists and people attending. Thank you for inviting me to introduce an overview of the EU funding program in support of biodiversity strategies, and that they do cover consequently blue carbon ecosystems. Next slide, please. So if we start from the original definition of blue carbon, they were designing a coastal and marine vegetated ecosystem as tidal marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses, storing a high amount of carbon through their root system and in the sediments. If we take the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC last IR6 report defines blue carbon as biologically driven carbon fluxes and storage in marine systems that are amenable to management, that open blue carbon concept to coastal and non-coastal processes. It extends to kelp forest, habitats formed by calcifying organisms, as Mars beds, shellfish, or even coral for their blue carbon potential, but also shelf and offshore marine sediments that store and sequester carbon. The most important issue is its capacity to have a long-term storage of carbon and their inherent determination by ecosystem processes and functioning. So research funding in support of biodiversity policies address by definition the carbon cycle and fabric of life, and in particular, blue carbon ecosystem localized in the coastal areas. Indeed, there are much more in addition to the carbon cycle features of the ecosystem functioning, because ecosystem functioning support a wide range of services, as you recall, Sindre, as nature benefits to people, habitat forming, spawning area, fisheries, nutrient cycling, primary production and oxygen production, coastal protection also from erosion and extreme weather event. So they are typical systems to exemplify nature-based solution. Next slide, please. Yet, marine habitats and ecosystem degradation is continuing faster than the measures taken to prevent them. And we still witness increasing anthropogenic threats, primarily from fisheries, sea uses, invasive alien species or pollution, coastal development, and now increasingly climate change impacts, especially from marine heat waves, and also acidification. If degraded or lost, carbon-rich ecosystems are not only losing their function and support of services, but also release most of the carbon they have stored for decades or centuries or even millennia back into the atmosphere. Next slide, please. So our research funding program has been designed in support of EU policies and EU commitment at international levels. So of course, we still have the Agenda for Sustainable Development, the SDG 30, the Global Biodiversity Framework from Montreal, with a target of protection restoration very well aligned with the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. This strategy is part of the European Green Deal. The European Green Deal is an array of strategy aiming at mainstreaming biodiversity targets, climate and pollution across all sectors. and define mutually supporting targets. I will focus a bit for our topic today on climate adaptation and the biodiversity. Indeed, the climate adaptation strategy emphasizes the importance of understanding better ecosystem and their adaptation potential, as well as the promotion of nature-based solutions. And the EU biodiversity strategy for 2030, next slide, please, introduce very important and ambitious targets, in particular of protection, to protect 30% of our seas, including 10% of strictly protected area, but with a strong integration of ecological corridor and area protected with effective management, effective resources, and also to cover area most vulnerable to climate change. It also introduced a nature restoration plan, which has been now translated into a nature restoration regulations, which ask to restore degraded ecosystems, in particular those with the most potential to capture and store carbon and to prevent and reduce the impact of natural disaster. These are quotes taken from the strategy text. And as well as how to do better with the 70% of the seas that will not be under protection, how to better do sea uses, better harness of those resources, notably by displaying or promoting ecosystem-based approach for a maritime spatial planning that will be informed by the knowledge of the actual functioning of the ecosystem, so we can stay within the boundaries of functionings. Next slide, please. So how to reach these very ambitious targets? We start from a situation where we still have a lot to learn from marine ecosystems. From a statistical extrapolation, we know at best 2/3 of species, maybe just 1/3, and not speaking only of the microbiome, of course. But we have big gaps to fill in our understanding and describing my ecosystem, so we can map, understand their dynamics, and so we can also inform policy, which are really informed on the actual processes. Next slide, please. So Horizon Europe started by very ambitious and large topics funding a project to do a leap in our understanding of marine biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, looking at species, ecosystem structures, proxies, connectivity, their variability in time and space across the water column, and also to look at their dynamics influenced by the impact of cumulative stressors, which are still at play and do actually affect differently together than taken individually. And they do have a strong difference when we consider them individually and to inform further models to, for instance, develop maritime spatial planning or even climate model, where some drivers or loss impact are just silent compared to most prominent ones. So it's important to really now have this capacity to consider all impact together. Next slide, please. And our capacity to act also will be dependent on our capacity to observe and monitor our ecosystem to see the effect of measures and to also adjust our models and to actually make models with a stronger and more robust biotic component, having new indicators and proxies notably informed by the project I mentioned earlier, and the capacity then to predict as well marine biodiversity, always to inform also our policy objective, also to feed the big endeavor, which is a digital twin of the ocean, like to have also user-friendly system to visualize and predict the effect of measures. And this topic also do ask project to work together and to cover the carbon cycle. Next slide, please. To start kicking off the implementation, the sequence of topics are also introducing several large initiatives for demonstration of how we can really do science-based maritime spatial planning, inform ecosystem-based management in specific area, and also to accelerate the mapping, identification of the most important area, carbon-rich area, or with high potential for carbon storage or carbon-rich ecosystems, notably the work of MPA Europe. Next slide, please. Of course, Horizon Europe was not limited to fund those topics, but there's several initiatives or several topics across different destinations that do address marine ecosystems and, of course, the carbon cycle and the way to support our capacity to protect and restore them. We had projects on topics for deep sea restoration, project on do hybrid nature-based solution between built or future project of infrastructure for coastal policies like coastal protection or renewable energy, and how to design them so that they include features that will be biodiversity positive or can make them also part of the ecosystem-based approach. Be useful project like with a bottom-up approach and having coastal communities in having the capacity to monitor and manage vulnerable areas. And next slide, please. I will not be able to go in all these details. I will also underline maybe sea blues here in those related topics towards a better understanding of climate relation with the ocean carbon cycle. But Sea Blue is a project coming from a topic of cooperation with China to look at blue carbon ecosystems and how they could be included under the reporting under the UNFCCC. Next slide, please. Very importantly, also, Horizon Europe introduced the EU missions, in particular, the mission Restore Ocean and Waters, with 3 pillars. The first pillar being protection and restoration, aligned with the biodiversity strategy for 2030 of 30% protection and restoration. Next slide, please. The originality of the mission is to fund very applied research or demonstration locally based and core to showcase a solution in different bioecoregions. They do cover coastal ecosystem. You have projects dealing with seagrass, kelp, even tidal marshes, and some horizontal topics for promoting cooperation of community of practices. And all these projects also are recipient of the advancing in knowledge and from the big project I mentioned earlier, and to make them like cooperating and using the best knowledge for informing science and hopefully to upscale all these solutions largely around Europe. And it's great to see, for instance, this webinar organized by several of these projects from the mission and from Horizon Europe Destination 1 I mentioned earlier. This is really what we wish to see. Next slide, please. Same other project, I will not go into detail. You can go to the next slide. And next slide, please. Because the West Coast is a very important Horizon 2020 project of, to showcase demonstration action for restoration, coming from the Green Deal call for the end of Horizon 2020. And it's a way also for me to introduce this publication, the Cordis project info pack on blue carbon for biodiversity and climate action. It's a selection of 15 projects, including from Horizon 2020. You have also future mares and microbios in displaying, analyzing and proposing nature-based solutions in the climate change impact scenarios, plus the most advanced Horizon Europe project. You can have the QR code to download this selection of projects. And also to look at the Mission Ocean and Water dashboard. Here, by a keyword search, you can look at the most relevant projects in your field, or here, for instance, of course, carbon-rich ecosystems, not only funded by Horizon Europe or previous framework program, but also funded by LIFE program and the MFAF program, the Fisheries and Aquaculture Fund, which are also doing activities in demonstration or deploying solution. And this is really where here we can see all the potential to really cross-fertilize and advance further the scaling up of our solutions. And I will stop here, hopefully, having some question or maybe going back to at the end of the session because I saw already 10 minutes passed. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Ivan, for this comprehensive go-through, both of the fundamentals, but also the various EU projects and program areas where you are involved. You showed this portfolio analysis you had done, which is, covering, I think, in some detail about the various projects. Very nice. And I haven't captured any questions in the chat directly to your presentation. I anticipate there might come some, so please follow the chat discussion. I note, however, one person asking whether the presentations will be shared afterwards, a standard question coming up if it's not being told explicitly. And I think the practice and intent is, but we need in a way to sort out that, let's say, all the photos we have the copyright on our side in sharing. So the answer to that question is that presentations will be shared afterwards, at least the textual elements. With these words, a little bit delayed relative to schedule, I would like to welcome Kjell Magnus Norderhaug. Kjell Magnus is a principal scientist at the Institute of Marine Research in Norway. His main field of interest is dynamics of coastal ecosystems, with particular focus on kelp forest ecology and trophic interaction. And he is also appointed by the Institute for Marine Research to lead the follow-up of the parliamentary decision on developing a national plan to restore Norway's kelp forest, a task commissioned by the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Fisheries. So please welcome Kjell Magnus to a presentation that focuses upon the northern kelp forests in Norway.
Sindre, and yeah, thank you for inviting me. Do you see my presentation now?
You need to make it that mode, yes.
Yes,
no,
there we go. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me speaking about this event taking place 50 years ago, and these are slides I put together with Camilla Fagerli at NIVA. Some 50 years ago, in the 1970s, fishermen started to report hordes of sea urchins grazing down kelp forests along the Norwegian coast. And this, the consequence of this was that thousands of square kilometers of kelp forest were completely grazed down and turned into a marine desert, only dominated by the urchin itself, as you see in the red frame here, affecting a large part of the Norwegian coast, indicated by red on the map here. At the time, there weren't any monitoring data that could reveal why this was caused by, but recently we were able to document overfishing of the predators of sea urchins, including wolffish, haddock and coastal cod, taking place in the decades before this event took place. And fishermen could, with that we interviewed, could tell us about every hook that held a wolffish when they entered a new virgin grounds of fishing, but then rapidly declined as fishing went on. And this was something that took place after decades of modernization of the coastal fishing fleet that had occurred during the last century. Fishermen got larger vessels, larger engines. The introduction of power blocks and nylon lines meant that they could fish deeper and further out. And also the government financially supported fishing families, especially after the Second World, to make fishing families increase their income. And at the same time also, Norwegians changed their food habits, and they started eating fish species that previously was regarded unwanted. And this has a name in Norwegian called ufisk. And they put these new fish on the menu, and celebrity chefs was invited to cooking programs on TV to teach Norwegians to prepare this ufisk, or unwanted fish. But several of these fish species was very vulnerable to fishing. Because we have learned more about the vulnerability of these fish species to fishing by, for instance, genetic methods. The historical perception was that the coast was being seeded with fish eggs from its inexhaustible source from the oceans. But during the last decades, molecular methods has changed this perception quite radically, and we now understand that many of these coastal stocks, they are quite isolated, and there are limited connectivity between the populations, and they are very vulnerable to also local fishing. And the consequence of this was the loss of the predator function from the combined community of predatory fish, leading to a predator release for the sea urchins and overgrazing, and then the collapse of the ecosystem. But since the 1990s, we have seen a recovery, a slow recovery, especially occurring along the southern margins of the barren ground area. And while still most of the grazed area is barren ground, sea urchins has retreated, and kelp forests have recovered along a coastline similar to some 500 kilometers or so. So it's a quite large area, and also there has been observed local recovery in the northernmost areas. And this recovery process is likely due to global warming. The green sea urchins, or Centrotus trabecuensis, is a cold water species. So we have observed reduced urchin recruitment on the southern margin, suggesting that the urchins are retreating due to warming. And at the same time, crabs are expanding northward, the Conesa crab from the south, but also invasive Kamchatka crab from Russia are entering Norwegian waters from the northeast. And they seem to have urchins on the menu. So in conclusion, large areas of kelp forests were grazed down by this horde of sea urchins in the 1970s. This urchin bloom and overgrazing event was likely caused by overfishing of urchin predators. But since the 1990s, kelp forests have recovered, and parts of the grazed area have come back. And this recovery is likely caused by global warming and expansion of crabs. Thank you. You are muted, Sindre.
Sorry. Thanks a lot, Kjell Magnus, for this good overview of what has happened to the northern Norwegian kelp forests. And because of this degradation that is now, gradually improving, but still at a very poor state, the kelp forest in most parts of northern Norway. That was a driving force of the parliamentary request to the government to make this plan of action to be developed. And in that discussion, the question, of course, has come up. How can we actually restore kelp forests? And that is the topic of the next presentation by Eli Rinde. Eli is a marine biologist and works as a senior researcher at Norwegian Institute for Water Research. Eli has a PhD in kelp forest ecology and more than 30 years of experience from ecological studies of kelp forests and seagrass meadows. So please take the stage, Eli, and say something about methods that could be used potentially to restore the kelp forests.
Thank you so much. My name is Eli Rinde, and as you say, I will give an overview of different methods for how to restore kelp forests in urchin barrens. Here's an overview of my presentation. I will first present some knowledge-based key measures to restore the lost kelp forests in urchin barrens. And I will give an overview of different methods, how to remove sea urchins on small and large spatial scale, and also different methods on how to control sea urchin abundance over time. And I will also show the different factors that implies the need for a coordinated and long-term strategy for this work. And finally, I will give an overview of some manuals and guidelines for this type of work. So we know that removal of sea urchins initiates the return of kelp forests in these barrens. And this is documented on small and large scale over 35 years. And this is recently described in a paper led by Hartvig Christie at NIVA that show the restoration of 70 hectares of sea urchin barrens in the Porsanger Fjord in the northernmost part of Norway, using 200 tons of quicklime. And this is a study performed by IMR and NIVA. And several studies in Norway and at a global scale, including California, Alaska, and New Zealand, show that sowing and planting or proximity to existing kelp forests is not needed to initiate kelp recovery in urchin barrens. However, most of these studies show that sea urchin control is needed to prevent new blooming of the urchins and grazing of the restored kelp forests. These pictures give an overview of the different methods that are available for removing sea urchins. And this can be done destructively, or you can harvest the sea urchins as a resource for food or as a raw material for other products. And this can be done on small scale and large scale. So at small scale, a diver can go and hammer and kill the sea urchins, or they can hand-pick the sea urchins. But this is obviously only possible on a small scale. But the quicklime study that I mentioned, that works on a large scale, and it is a destructive method. You cannot use the urchins as food. Fortunately, recently, in the last few years, there's a lot of interest in developing tools or devices that can be used to at a more large scale restoration projects. So mechanic devices are developed that can suck up the urchins, and it is also developed traps that can be baited with algae that attracts the sea urchins when the traps are lying on the seafloor for some days. And that can be used on both small and large scale. And it is estimated that a fisherman can harvest about 20 tons of sea urchins if this fishery is done in an efficient manner in a week. However, in order to get the kelp back, if it should be able to recover in these areas, it is important that sea urchin density is reduced to a sufficiently low level. And it is likely that the fishermen need to be paid a kind of a carbon or a biodiversity credit to ensure that they will do this extra effort when the densities of the sea urchins are low. So, and it is, how can you control the sea urchins? It is possible that you could prioritize the southern part of the grazed region in Norway, as Kjell Magnus pointed to, that the sea urchins struggle in this southern part. You could also choose areas with few hiding places for the urchins, such as smooth bedrocks, or you can maybe also additionally, you should select areas with a large distance to merle and stony bottom, which functions as breeding areas for the sea urchins. And one hypothesis is that if you restore a sufficiently large area, this could initiate a self-sustaining ecosystem with the predators needed to control the sea urchins. But we don't know if this is possible yet without repeating sea urchin removal, or you have to combine other measures to control the urchins. And it could also be that the size need to vary between regions to enable this kind of self-sustaining ecosystem. But We do know that an increase in the population of predators, as Kjell Magnus was mentioning. So we know that the increased abundance of edible crab has resulted in the natural recovery of kelp forests in the southern part of Norway, and that this is linked to ocean warming and a northward expansion of this edible crab. And we also know that the increased abundance of the alien species red king crab has resulted in kelp recovery of a large area in Porsanger Fjord in the northernmost part of Norway. However, recently we have observed a negative development of the recovered kelp in this fjord because of the decline in the king crab abundance, which then is related to fishery. And this is described in a new paper that has recently been submitted. And there are different ways of how you can ensure predator control. It is possible that you could protect key predators such as the wolffish, cod, and edible crabs using MPAs and no-take areas to ensure that the population increases of these predators. It is also possible to breed and release predators such as wolffish, or you can create artificial hiding places and habitats for predators if these are lacking. But it is important to monitor and have an ecosystem-based management of these key species in the system to ensure that you have this trophic balance, as exemplified with Porsanger Fjord, where the sea urchins are blooming again when the king crab population is reduced. So there are several factors that implies a need for a coordinated and long-term strategy for successfully restore kelp forests. So first of all, it is a very large area that needs to be restored. It is estimated to be about 5,000 square kilometers. And as I have mentioned, you can use different methods and scales for sea urchin removal. You can do this destructively, or you can harvest the sea urchins as a resource. But the latter demands that you have a value chain in place for the products. And there are also different methods and scales to control the sea urchins. So you can protect or manage areas and the predators. You can breed and release the predators or some key species of these. And you can create and deploy artificial marine habitats as shelters for key predators. And we also think it's a need to have locally adapted solutions because different environmental conditions results in variations in recruitment and growth and survival of both the kelp and the sea urchins and the predators. And all these variation needs to be taken into account. And finally, it's a lot of different actors involved in this kind of restoration actions from both industry, management, and researchers. So the strategy needs to be knowledge-based, it needs to be holistic, and it needs to have a long-term perspective. And also the efforts have to be coordinated to successfully restore kelp forest on large spatial scale. And here's an overview of available manuals and guidelines. In 2021, Sea Forester, NIVA, and Aquaplan NIVA published a tailored strategy for how to restore kelp forests in northern Norway. And they also provided fact sheets for the general public, for decision makers, and for industry. In 2022, Aron Eger led a global review of kelp forest restoration. And last year, Nordic Digital Handbook was published, which also includes sea urchin removal as a nature-based solution for restoring kelp forests in the Nordic countries. And finally, we have published a rewilding manual that provides some general guidelines and principles for promoting marine biodiversity. That also includes kelp forest restoration. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Eli. I have noted a few questions in the chat directed towards you. Given that we are a little bit behind schedule, I will encourage you to try to address those questions in the chat while I leave the stage to the last speaker of today's webinar, Gunnar Sander. He's a senior researcher at the Norwegian Institute for Water Research, and he holds a PhD in social science, has extensive experience in marine science and management, including both monitoring and ecosystem-based managing. He also has a history from the Norwegian Polar Institute and the European Environment Agency prior to starting here at NIVA. So please share with you some insights into the Norwegian management and governance system, Gunnar.
Thank you, Sindre. This presentation is made in collaboration with my colleague Frode Sundnes. And before I continue, there is one background information which is important. Norway is not a member of the EU. So we have a collaboration agreement with the EU, which makes us bound by quite a lot of EU legislation. But on other issues, such as ocean management, we are not bound by the EU. So I may make a few references to EU legislation just to make comparisons for you. In the global kelp assessment,
do you share your presentation, Gunnar?
Pardon?
Do you intend to share your presentation? I think you.
I thought I already did.
No, not to my screen. So.
Okay. I clicked on share screen, and I've clicked on the screen to select here.
Now it comes. Now it comes.
Okay, fine.
Presentation mode also, please. There we are.
Fine. I was the lead author on the chapter on management in the Into the Blue report that Sindre has told you about. And we made first some observations there. There was very little attention to kelp in ocean governance in general at that time. And maybe not surprisingly, there were no specific global instruments directed at kelp. So we very soon found out that one of the key recommendations should be that we need to adapt more general ones. For instance, there are a lot of biodiversity-related conventions. They need to be adapted to address also kelp decline. We also saw that there are very, very many national instruments for managing kelp harvesting, which is maybe the most traditional way of for humans to relate to kelp. We also had some main recommendations on how to manage. We say that ecosystem-based management should be a key approach. I'll come back to that, what it means, but we thought about that as a kind of umbrella, which could include marine spatial planning and marine protected areas. And for those, especially for marine protected areas, it's important to underline that they cannot protect against the local pressures. They can only protect against local pressures, but the external ones, like nutrients coming from land, climate change, or species migrating in and out of the protected areas, they cannot be, they are not efficient. Therefore, you need broader approaches like ecosystem-based management. And when it comes to the rules for kelp harvesting, we said that they should be assessed and regularly adapted. So what is the situation, the diagnosis for Norway? Basically, exactly the same. No specific instruments for kelp, except for kelp harvesting. We have a lot of instruments that potentially could be applied. And only since this Into the Blue report was published, we have seen that they gradually begin to be applied. But quite a lot of what I will tell you about will be opportunities for how to manage kelp. I said that ecosystem-based management should be key, and I think it's needed to underline what it is, because the key issue here is that you should manage cumulative impacts on the ecosystem. You will need to understand the system itself, the kelp ecosystem, which already has been described by Kjell Magnus, by the kelp itself and the other inhabitants there, as indicated in the figure. The key issue here is to understand how multiple pressures from all relevant sectors combine to get cumulative impacts. And it may be quite obvious to understand that if you trawl for kelp, you directly affect the kelp ecosystem. But especially the cascading effects of fishing, which Kjell Magnus described as the causing effect, of the grazing events in Northern Norway, that is not intuitively to understand. So you must try to understand both the direct and the indirect impacts. The key issue, however, is that you don't only do the cumulative impact assessment. You need to make a plan for how to manage, which would require separate assessment and a program of measures. And in such a management plan, you will usually mobilize sectoral management with their own separate instruments. And you can also designate a role for marine spatial planning and a role for marine protected areas. If you look at ecosystem-based management in Norway, one thing which is maybe a little peculiar to compared to some EU countries is that there is a sharp divide between the instruments we have in the ocean and in the coast. As opposed to what we know from collaborative projects is the situation in, for instance, the Mediterranean countries, where the Marine Strategy Framework Directive goes all the way into the coast or into land in most of the coastal states. In the ocean, Norway has ocean management plans that provide holistic ecosystem-based management. However, kelp doesn't grow here. Still, these plants have a more general role towards managing marine systems, so there are quite a lot of signals about kelp management, but not a single measure, which is supposed to happen in coastal management. And in the coast, EU's Water Framework Directive apply. That is a directive primarily addressing freshwater and eutrophication and contaminants in freshwater with a coastal zone attached to it. However, Norway, for geographical circumstances, has a huge coastal zone compared to most European countries. So this is quite critical for understanding the role of the Water Framework Directive in Norway. The Water Framework Directive excludes large parts of the ecosystem when assessing for what is good ecological status. And the indicators used for kelp has very little relevance. So kelp is not addressed in the river basin management plans. I revised half of them, and you don't find references to the state of kelp in general in these. However, it must be underlined that still in the individual sectors, they act on pressures relevant to kelp, for instance, by trying to reduce contamination from agriculture and urban wastewater. And there is also worth mentioning that there is a provision in the Nature Biodiversity Act on ecosystem approach and cumulative impact, even though this is very, very unspecific. I'm working with colleagues at the legal faculty at the University of Tromsø at the moment, trying to go more deeply into what this may mean. Then we have marine spatial planning. And the marine spatial planning in Norway is an extension of land-based spatial planning, which we have practiced for 100 years or so, where the municipalities play a key role. And along most sections of the coast, the expanding aquaculture industry has been a driver. So we see several examples, more and more examples of how the plans set off areas with different degrees of restrictions on the uses. Here is an example from the Oslo Fjord, where there is one tiny little area set off to protect seagrass. What also should be mentioned is that under the same law, the Plan and Building Act, there are also national guidelines that require protection of kelp for climatic reasons, as we've heard about. Marine protected areas has been very controversial in Norway, and there was a committee that proposed several areas in 2004, and that was very delayed in its progress afterwards because of discussions between fisheries management and environmental management sectors. So a white paper in 2021 resulted in a new initiative. So the few, you see the blue and the green ones here, these were the marine protected areas and natural parks in 2021. The rest were areas where processes were to start. These processes have started, and we see that kelp forests are registered and included as reasons for protection in many of these areas. And the kelp trawling, that definitely is a contested practice in Norway. Norway is the second largest harvester at the global scale, and kelp is harvested at the 5-year intervals in certain designated areas. There are regional regulations that are revised every 5th year as well, so we follow the advice from Into the Blue about having an adaptive management system for harvesting. However, this is quite controversial because kelp itself recovers after 3 to 4 years, Institute Marine Research has established. But for the ecosystem, it's to be more fully recovered, you will need at least 6 or 7 years. So this is one line of discussions. There are also sectoral and legal strides. For instance, about to what extent birds should be included. I have linked to one article below where you can read more about that. And we see local opposition many places towards trawling of kelp. Then the Nature Diversity Act of Norway has a couple of other possibilities to protect species, which may not be so relevant in this context because of the strict criteria for designation. But kelp may be a habitat type that may be a so-called selected type, because there you also have importance for priority species as one of the criteria. And several bird species, for instance, that are listed rely on kelp habitats. So this is one of several unused possibilities in Norwegian legislation. Then to initiatives for restoration. Sindre has already referred to the decision from all the political parties in the parliament when they requested the government to present a plan and suggest measures to systematically restore Norwegian kelp forests along the coast. It came as a surprise to many of us last year, but it was the result of lobbying from one environmental NGO, which, when we talked with them, said that they had used very much of the information from the Norwegian Blue Forest Network, which is not an advocacy organization as opposed to them. And more general, Norway has also signed the Kunming-Montreal framework, so we should restore 30% of areas as well. So there are several initiatives exploring how to proceed with that. We had a conference in Tromsø in November 2024, where the idea was to give input. So we had a lot of working groups for people to work with to work on the advice to the content of the plan for Northern Norway alone. So it was suggested a vision that kelp forests should be back as a self-regulating ecosystem. There were time-framed objectives. You see 30% by 2030, but 100% later, which is quite ambitious. When people discuss what measures that should be prioritized, they said that fisheries management is most important. And that was very much due to what Kjell Magnus has told about, that the triggering event probably was poor fishery management. Then you see other suggestions here. There were discussions about top-down government versus bottom-up inclusion of other actors, how to include scientific advice, how to fund, what are the legal barriers for restoration, and finally, how we could have adaptive management, which Eli already has alluded to at the end of her presentation. So for time constraints, I stop the presentation here. But if you want to know more about what happens afterward, Kjell Magnus is here, and he has a key role in following up on the plan that the government will develop. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gunnar, for this comprehensive overview of the Norwegian kelp management and governance systems, and also pointing to some details about the forthcoming work on the program of restoration or the plan of restoration that's starting up now. Just to remind the participants of the webinar, we have set aside the time until 3:15 for a final round of major questions and discussions. Some of you have posted some relevant questions in the chat. Please continue to do that. You could also raise your hand if you would like to pose a question orally. My colleague Sebastian will provide you access to the microphone so that it will be heard. But let me start up with a couple of questions that has been posed in the chat. Let me take one from Brian Takeda first here, which I think is mostly targeting the Norwegian speakers today. Brian is based in Norway, I know, knowing about the EU restoration law adopted last year. And Brian would like the speakers to provide some thoughts on this particular law and how this may influence restoration policy in Norway. I could say something about it, but I think both Kjell Magnus and Gunnar, maybe also Eli, could say something about that. I'm not sure if
I can start with the formalities here, because the collaboration agreement between Norway and the EU means that all new legislation in the EU should be revised in a EEA committee. EEA is the European Economic Area. So this is clearly relevant for the collaboration agreement, but no decision has been taken. So far, Norway can be inspired by what we read in EU's legislation, but we are so far not formally bound by it. But however, we have the Kunming-Montreal obligations, and they are gradually being starting to influence Norway's approaches nationally, as I briefly described.
Would you like to add something, Kjell Magnus or Eli, to the answer given by... No, not Eli, Kjell Magnus?
Set into the legislation part, I think the scale of loss of kelp forest in Norway is so large that this will be an important part of Norway's obligations to several of these goals. For instance, the 30% 30 by 30 goal. But yes, I think I leave it with that. I think Gunnar is the right person to answer this and not me.
I could also add that the Norwegian Environment Agency just has released a tender for not too big project, but still a project which is aimed actually to map nature that is restorable the project should suggest approaches that is mapping of let's say ecosystem patches of valuable ecosystems that are seriously degraded. So there is a little bit of movement towards, let's say, the aim and procedures of the EU restoration law. But as Gunnar said, the government has not decided to implement it. But because of the coming Montreal Framework Agreement, there is quite a lot happening, which is quite parallel to the implementation of the EU restoration law. Okay, I think we stopped there for that question. Then there was another one from someone named Jamie Lee, which maybe you would like to pose it orally, Jamie, or should I take it and pose it on your behalf? Let's do it the latter way, and then you can complement if you would like to follow up. Jamie says that there seems to be increased governmental and private investments for seaweed biorefinery at scale in Norway, targeting the use of wild biomass coming from kelp harvesting. Is the status of kelp forests and its management connected to industry utilization plans? And I think that question is one where you might be fit to answer, Kjell Magnus, since you at IMR are advising the government on various matters relating to this.
Yeah, so we have a major loss of kelp forests in northern Norway and in southern Norway due to marine heat waves. But we have a large area in between where kelp forest is mainly in a good state. And I think NIVA has modeled the total biomass of kelp in Norway to be something around 50 million tons or so. Of this, every year in this more reference state area of kelp forest, we have kelp harvesting on an industrial scale. But and the harvesters, they are regulated in sectors so that the coast is divided into sectors that are harvested every 5 years or so, and the industry takes out 150,000 tons per year. So on a national scale, this is insignificant in mind, but it can, of course, locally some places be problematic. And also, one of the advices we have been stressing is that there is no ceiling within each sector every year. And at the moment, there is only one company that is harvesting kelp in Norway, but it's quickly increasing. There are several other companies that are interested. And if there is a competition for the resources within the sectors, then the outtake could be larger and possess a bigger problem than it is today. But at the moment, the kelp harvesting in Norway is sustainable.
Thanks, Kjell Magnus. Would you like to add something to this, Eli and Gunnar? I can't see you now.
Maybe I could just add that we have done some calculation about how much is harvested in the county where we harvest most of the wild kelp, and it varies a lot between the different sectors. So you could have a very high harvesting efficiency in some areas. So, and we have suggested that because now all of the kelp forest is available for harvesting every 5th year, or in the southern part it is also every 4th year. So we have suggested that it should be, because then you have over a time period of 10 years, you have a lot of areas that could be potentially be harvested. And we think it would be more wise to set up some of the core areas of the kelp forest to be not trawled. But now everything is allowed except for some small reference areas or yeah.
Thanks a lot. Gunnar, do you want to add something?
No, I think Eli was addressing at the end of her intervention now the thing that I'm thinking about. I think it's fun to compare this with forestry and forestry management. I mean, you could foresee that you have certain patches where you're simply interested in cultivating kelp and harvest kelp, and that's it, and leave larger areas outside that untouched. Or as it is now, that you kind of open up everywhere. So this is one of the things that I think is interesting to discuss for the future.
I see you have raised your hand, Kjell Magnus. Do you have?
I certainly agree, and I think this is also part of the MPA discussion for Norway that is going on now, and Norway has a challenge in lack of regulation within our MPAs, so we need proper regulation and also enforcement following the proper IUCN criteria if we are going to call them MPAs. So I think all of this is part of the larger coastal ecosystem and the use of marine protected areas and OSMs. Thank you.
Thank you. A good discussion. I would like to turn over to you, Ivan. You provided a good overview of let's say the ongoing, to a large extent, project portfolio under Horizon Europe. For those of us who attended the European Ocean Days recently, there was quite a bit of discussion regarding the upcoming, presumably important policy document, the Oceans Pact. And given your position from within DG Research and Innovation and your focus upon marine biodiversity, including blue forest, blue carbon, how strong do you think that the emphasis will be on blue forest and blue carbon in the Oceans Pact? Even though we may not know, I mean, the policy, the actual impact of that policy documents. But could you say a bit on that? I presume you have more insight than most others of us into the particularities of its development.
Yeah, so it's in preparation. It's high on the political agenda of this new commission. Well, there will be, I mean, of course, it will be a new document. I was going to say it's not a revolution because I should not say that, but it will build on what has been launched. I mean, the importance and what we are working on is not to lose all the momentum we have been building in the previous year, especially during the Green Deal time of the last 5 years, with a strong research innovation funding program to support actionable solution for marine ecosystem and coastal ecosystems. So it reinforces the need for knowledge-based actions, informations, to have, of course, a stronger emphasis on the blue economy, but keeping the word like we have to really implement, to stay within the boundaries of functioning, and also considering that we have fast-changing abiotic component of ecosystem, marine heat wave, and different aspects which are launched and will not be reversible for decades and ages. So how to help adapt also the European blue economy to the coming changes, and we hope to keep supporting member states into the implementation of the natural restoration and the protection pledges. The target for the first phase of the natural restoration regulation is for September 26 or August, to have the first array of mapping of habitats and prioritization, as well as selection of restoration measures already identified. So that will be launched as part of the Ocean Pact. So it will be an umbrella to reinforce the importance of the blue economy and the necessity to have a very knowledge-based information and choice made. Then the final formulation will come the next month. It's between DG Mare and DG Growth and different services. But the spirit is to keep the momentum to keep the science base and toward keeping the blue economy alive with functioning ecosystems.
Thanks. I know that the Commission launched a public consultation on the Oceans Pact, but I don't recall from the top of my head whether that consultation has ended or if it's still possible to feed in viewpoints from individual or institutional perspective. Would you know that?
I don't have that in mind, but it's very easy to quickly check, or I will post it if I got the last date. I will post it in the chat.
Yeah. I pose a question to all of you, since you, I think all the Norwegian contributors to this webinar were also authors of this joint UNEP and the Norwegian Blue Forest Network report from 23 that was global in its scope. Could you contrast the Norwegian management and governance perspectives to other European countries, such as, for instance, Portugal? I know that in Scotland they have a much more restrictive view and a much more stronger emphasis on protection. But other European countries, could you contrast a little bit the Norwegian views on these matters with other European? I'm not sure how familiar you are with the French or the, let's say, Portuguese. I'm looking at Kjell Magnus and Gunnar and Eli, and also you, Ivan, maybe you have some insights in let's say the sustainability aspect, how much utilization is weighted relative to protection and conservation in other European kelp nations.
Well, I can perhaps comment shortly on this. I know that there is small-scale harvesting of kelp in France, and that there was an initiative in Scotland to start kelp harvesting that was stopped even before it was started because of resistance against it. So, but otherwise, I think in Norway we have, I think we have the same challenges with marine protected areas as most other European countries, that there is too little content of the areas and they are not working and functioning as they are supposed to. So I think this is something that is common across Europe, really.
Thanks. I see that we are coming close to 15:15, and I think we haven't received any further discussion items in the chat or in the Q&A part. So I think we close the webinar and thank for the attendance by the audience that has dropped a bit after 3 o'clock, but I think was close to 100 attendees, which was nice. And I also would take opportunity and thank the presenters for very nice and good and informative presentations. There has been questions whether presentations will be made available, and I think we promised that. The AIR Center in Portugal, I think, have the email addresses of all registered. So when the recording and the presentations as PDF are available, you will all be notified about their availability. And in the presentations, also the speakers' email addresses will be provided. So those who would like to get in touch and get a little bit more details can approach them then. Thank you very much, everyone. And
thank you.
You heard, there was a restoration plan being developed here now in 25 and 26. So as a cliffhanger, we look forward to meeting you end 2026 when the National Norwegian Restoration Plan for kelp forest will be launched. I think we promised that already now. Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. A pleasure. Good day.